Almost every day I hear or read about how Absolute Batman and all the other Absolute superheroes are just living the worst lives imaginable, from Wonder Woman living in literal hell, Superman being hunted down by this demon version of Brainiac, and to Batman just going through the ringer by living in super Gotham, with Bane who is 100 times bigger, and Batman is also fighting demon versions of his villains, like this demon version of Joker and this demon version of Mr. Freeze. Like Absolute Mr. Freeze and Absolute Joker are just pure nightmare fuel, and it really got me wondering. So far there are 6 Absolute stories out right now, with some of the most iconic DC superheroes, that being Absolute Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, and Martian Manhunter, all having their Absolute versions. And out of these 6 superheroes, I really wanted to find out who has the worst life in the Absolute universe. And I know that might be a hard question to answer, since all of these superheroes have pretty sucky lives that would make any normal superhero quit on their first day. But today I will rank and explain who has it the worst out of these 6 members of the original Justice League, except for Aquaman doesn't have an Absolute version because, you know, apparently they don't care about Aquaman getting an Absolute version. But first off, let me give you a mini breakdown of what the Absolute universe is, in case you don't know too much about this Absolute universe, and give a brief backstory to each of these Absolute superheroes so we can fully understand why each of these heroes' lives are hell on earth. First off, to explain what Absolute heroes are, they're pretty much a version of iconic DC heroes where their most iconic trait of them is taken away from them. Like this version of Batman is broke, this version of Wonder Woman grew up in hell, and this version of Superman never grew up on a farm. So since they took away these core aspects to these heroes, they turn out a little bit differently to make up for their flaws. Like since Batman is broke in this version, he has to be more brutal and jacked since he doesn't have all of his insane tech and gadgets like how he usually does in the mainline Batman stories. But now that I gave you a brief explanation of what the Absolute DC universe is, I want to explain each of these Absolute heroes' backstories and kind of what makes them have a horrible life throughout these Absolute stories, to really figure out and really break down who is living the worst life out of these 6 members. And I have read all of these Absolute stories, but however, they are still coming out, so these heroes can go through much worse in the future. So keep that in mind because these heroes can definitely face even worse threats than what I know in this video. But first off, let's break down the Trinity, which of course we have this version of Batman growing up without all of his riches, but his villains are even more crazy, with Bane who makes Batman look like a doll compared to him, and Gotham in general somehow is even worse than the original Gotham, which is pretty insane since, you know, regular Gotham is already hell on earth, so now Absolute Gotham is just pretty much super hell. Then we have Absolute Superman who lands on earth as a teenager, so he doesn't have his loving parents of Kansas and is being hunted down by the world governments, as well as this version of Brainiac is just a crazy insane person, kind of like the Joker. So when you combine the power of Brainiac and the insanity of the Joker, you get such a devious villain. And this Brainiac is just constantly tweaking every time he sees Superman. And this version of Superman also has to fight this superpowered version of Ra's al Ghul, which he looks pretty massive and even makes Superman look small, which is just insane. And I'm happy this version of Ra's al Ghul is a Superman villain, since Absolute Batman already has enough on his plate with his villains. Then we have Absolute Wonder Woman, with her backstory being that she was abandoned by the gods and was punished to be raised in hell by the sorcerer named Cersei, and is definitely more menacing with her fighting style since she did grow up on hell, using a buster sword and riding undead unicorns. Now that is just pretty much the gist to the Trinity's backstory. Obviously each of these characters can go more in depth, but I kind of want to give a simple backstory since these are the most popular ones. I want to cover now the lesser known Absolute heroes, which even though they're not as iconic as the Trinity, their backstory is equally as horrible. Starting off, we have Absolute Flash, with his backstory being that this version of Wally West was being stationed at a military base because his dad works for the government and his mom is not alive to take care of him, so he has to stay at this military base, and happens to walk on Barry Allen doing an experiment with his flash powers, and the machine blows up because Wally West interferes and distracts Barry, and the machine ends up killing Barry Allen, but ends up leaving Wally West with the flash powers. But with no mentor to guide Wally West with his newfound flash powers, he is just constantly tweaking out with his super speed, and the government now is just chasing him since they want to use his powers for their own agenda, and is also wanted for blowing up a science lab that is owned by the government. And what is probably the most craziest thing about this version of Absolute Flash is that he does not have the Speed Force, which, you know, you might be thinking, what do you mean he does not have the Speed Force? Well, instead of having the Speed Force, he pretty much just needs to consume energy to refuel his super speed. And I'm not talking about, you know, food, I'm talking about literal energy like lightning and electricity. So pretty much throughout his whole entire story, he's just starving because he doesn't have all of this energy to keep him up while he's using his flash powers. Which I would say Absolute Flash's backstory and kind of arc is similar to Absolute Superman because they are both being chased by shadow governments. But then we have our next Absolute character, which is Absolute Green Lantern, which is probably the weirdest one to break down since this story has 3 iconic Green Lanterns, 4 if you want to count Guy Gardner, with having Hal Jordan, John Stewart, and Joe, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce her last name, but these iconic Green Lanterns are all in the Absoulte story and have their world invaded by a Green Lantern named Absoulte, the alien who usually gives his ring to Hal Jordan. But instead, when he pulls up in the Absoulte universe, he comes to judge the citizens of a town to see who is worthy and covers the earth in a dorm to truly figure out how worthy these people are. And each of these 3 Green Lanterns kind of have a different outcome on what they get as powers. Because John Stewart becomes a literal god because he is the most worthy in Absoulte's view and ends up getting the Yellow Lantern because the Yellow Lantern in this version is considered the highest version of a lantern. Then we have Joe, who becomes the mainline Green Lantern but doesn't really know how to use her powers. And finally we have Hal Jordan getting the worst outcome, getting the Black Hand, which this Black Hand pretty much just kills everyone he comes across every time he's afraid, which in the story he's pretty afraid throughout this whole entire story because he has a literal Black Hand and got his city invaded by literal aliens. Now since Absolute Green Lantern is composed of a lot of members, I'll go with the mainline girl when we look at who is struggling the most out of these Absolute characters, since she is supposed to be the main character by being in the front cover of pretty much all of the comics. But Hal Jordan is a major part of the story as well, but he's more of an antagonist, so I won't consider him the main character like Joe is in this Absolute Green Lantern story. So it's gonna bring down the level of struggle difficulty when it comes to Joe and Hal Jordan, but I have to stick with Joe when we have to compare who has the worst life out of all of these Absolute characters. Now the final Absolute story before we get into the rankings of who has the worst life out of all of these Absolute versions, we have Absolute Martian Manhunter, which is probably the hero who gets the most dramatic changes out of all of these heroes, with this version of Martian Manhunter invading the mind of a dead police officer right as he's dying, which ends up saving his life, but they both now have to share the same body. And this police officer named John starts being able to smell people's emotions and thoughts everywhere he goes, and starts kind of losing his identity because he has 2 personalities inside of him, but uses these newfound powers to stop crimes and kind of fully understand what's going on in the city. But also, since he's losing his identity and getting so stuck on solving crimes, he starts becoming less available for his family and starts listening more to the Martian Manhunter inside of his head. And Absolute Martian Manhunter has to even fight the White Martian Manhunter invading his city, and this White Martian Manhunter is pretty crazy as well, since he uses people's nightmares and fears as his own power sources. Like if a person is dreaming of a nuclear bomb, the White Martian can literally pull it out of someone's memories and drop it on Absolute Martian Manhunter, which is pretty insane. And this comic is pretty trippy in general to even explain, since this story is more of a psychological story than any other Absolute story, where all the other Absolute stories are about villains becoming even more deadly and bigger, but this version of Absolute Martian Manhunter is more about, you know, understanding why people are so messed up. But it's definitely a really good Absolute comic, and if I had to recommend any Absolute comic, it would be this one, since currently this is my favorite run right now. But that is every Absolute backstory in a short summary. Now let's get to the rankings and really figure out who out of these 6 heroes have the worst life in their Absolute stories. And it was definitely really hard to rank these because all of these heroes are really having a struggle off. First off, in last place, I would say Green Lantern has the easiest life. Even though she goes through trials and tribulations, she really didn't have any issues before becoming a Green Lantern. She lived a regular life, and out of these 3 Green Lanterns, Hal Jordan definitely got the worst outcome, while she was pretty fine except for the fact that her friends were pretty messed up now. So in my opinion, she definitely has the easiest life out of these Absolute heroes, but having the easiest life is definitely not that easy because, you know, you're literally getting your planet invaded by aliens. But second to last place, it was hard to either decide between Martian Manhunter or Wonder Woman, but I ended up going with Martian Manhunter since John the police officer did get his life saved by this version of Martian Manhunter, so that's kind of good, as well as him not having to go through too much hardships except for him being a bit neglectful to his family and having to experience the pain of people's emotions. And the reason why I have Martian Manhunter over Green Lantern as having a worse life than Green Lanterns is because John did die after all, so that must have been crazy painful, as well as his child has been invaded by the White Martian, so that seems to pretty suck, and that is more of a recent development. And of course, Martian Manhunter's world did end because, you know, he had to leave his planet, so that gives him a slight edge over Green Lantern as having a worse life. Then obviously we have Absolute Wonder Woman, who even though she did grow up in hell, which does sound like it would pretty suck, she was still raised pretty well since Cersei did care for her as a motherly figure and was kept pretty safe since she didn't really have to fight any crazy demons that gave her so much trouble, since she was a god and was able to take down a lot of these demons even if she had to do it in more brutal ways. So I feel like out of all of these Absolute superheroes, you could argue that I feel like she didn't didn't go through too much hardships since she really did have a good foundation for her upbringing, except for, growing up in literal hell. But in her stories, she definitely has to fight stronger opponents because in her story she's fighting literal gods. So when it comes to her backstories, I think that's the weaker side, but when it comes to what she's doing in the current present, I feel like she's facing a lot bigger issues, which is pretty funny to say that living in hell is not that big of a deal compared to what you're doing in the current present, but that just shows you how insane some of these backstories are. Now, getting into the top 3 of the worst lives of the Absoulte universe, we have Absolute Flash, which is hard for me not to put any higher since it doesn't have too many comics as much as the rest of these Absolute DC stories, since it's still pretty new and only has like 7 issues while Absolute Batman is almost at its 20th. But in the short amount of time it's been out, he has definitely gone through some trials and tribulations, with him already losing his mother and his father already being not really there for him and looks like he's not gonna make it to the end of the story, and also Wally West blaming himself for killing Barry Allen and getting one of the worst superpowers to ever get when you have no idea how it works, with super speed, with this version of Flash going in and out of consciousness every time he uses these powers. And what makes it worse is that everywhere he goes, he is constantly starving since he has no real food that can fuel him, since the only thing that can satisfy his hunger is literal energy that he needs to keep him up while using his super speed. And he has to use this super speed a lot since he is running away from a branch of a government that is hunting him down with Black Force ops that have literal superpowers and are superpowered villains. So it's hard not to say that he's living one of the hardest lives out of all of these Absolute superheroes, not to mention he is a kid while he's doing this all with no guidance. Like, at least Absolute Wonder Woman had Cersei to help her with her upbringing, but Absolute Flash's backstory still feels like it's developing since he hasn't really become the full superhero like Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman are so far. So for all we know, Flash could definitely get a worse life as the story goes on, and I wouldn't be surprised because he is really struggling in the story and we're only at the beginning of his story. But now we're in our top 2 of Absolute Superman and Absolute Batman. Both Absolute versions have horrible lives, but when it comes down to the ultimate struggle off between these two characters, it really depends on what you think is a horrible life. Would it be a life that is more pain as it goes on, which is more like Absolute Batman's story, or would it be a life where you are struggling constantly throughout your life, but at least you have the power to fight back, but not strong enough to deal with everything coming your way, which is a lot like Absolute Superman's story, since Absolute Batman's life is progressively getting worse as it goes on, since it started off with him just losing his family, but he was still super smart and could have become rich with all of his smarts and all of his intellect and all of the inventions he was making, but decides to use it to fight crime and pretends to be a nobody in his real life to hide the fact that he is Batman behind being an average working man. But as the story goes on, he goes from fighting brutal gang members to fighting Lovecraftian beasts and giant muscle monsters who look like they take a shot of bodybuilders' roids that they take in a year. While Superman, on the other hand, since he was a child, witnessed his home planet and family die in an explosion and was fully conscious to see it all, not like in the original story where he was a baby. And when he gets to Earth and lands in Kansas, the Kents only take care of him for a couple of weeks or even a couple of days before he gets raided by the government and has to run away. So he had the taste of what a family could feel like after his original family died, but it got ripped away from him by the government, and is now constantly on the run helping people where he can as kind of a wandering traveler with no place to call home. So when it comes to these two absolute heroes, when it comes to who has the worst life, it is honestly tied for me. But if I had to choose, I would probably go with Absolute Batman having the worst life out of them all, since he is fighting these monsters with no powers and is just tweaking out in almost all of his stories by living in nightmare difficulty Gotham. And at least Superman can fight back sort of and only has to worry about the major villains really hurting him, not really the low level soldiers. While Absolute Batman is always fighting someone way out of his league. Not to mention he is broke, which might be a face worse than death, which we know that any superhero who is broke is just living the worst life possible. Look at Spider-Man. But that is my ranking of who I believe has the worst life out of all of these Absolute superheroes. Let me know who you guys believe has the worst life. I definitely didn't want to mention Absolute Green Arrow because, he got packed up in his first issue, and, I don't even think this is an Absolute version. This is just the regular Green Lantern, and in this story, the regular superheroes cannot survive this world. But let me know what you guys think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to hear pitches of Absolute versions for Marvel heroes, I have videos, and you can click right here to see them. So I hope to see you guys next time. Later, Peace.